Namaste, and I welcome you all to this 10 p.m. live show. And today I have Professor Subhash Kak with me. You know Professor Subhash Kak very well. You know that he is the Regents Professor in University of Oklahoma Stillwater, and also a visiting professor in JNU, and also a member of Prime Minister's Scientific and Innovation Council. Good evening, Professor Kak. How are you?
Good evening. Wonderful to be here on your show. Looking forward to this conversation.
And today, I am going to discuss an article that you wrote, and I thought it was pretty comprehensive and very focused, The Big Scandal of Indology. And all of us know that most of our problems or narratives stem from the flawed Indology that has kind of taken root in the academia, not just in India, but all over the world. In fact, most of the problems of Indian academia looking up to the Western academia and getting controlled by the Western academia is rooted in this Indology business. That's where we get our inferiority complexes. That's where we get our urge to keep seeking approval from the West for even small things. Even politicians do that. Even now, though we have a BJP government which is supposed to be Indic and more sympathetic towards Hindus, but even then, a lot of these narratives it is very hesitant to dismantle because it keeps seeking approval from those who hold the power of narrative. So that's a big issue. You described it beautifully. Let me hear from you only.
Okay, the story is that after the coming of the British and the European discovery of Sanskrit, goes back to William James. For some time, there was this romance of India, but later on, the Sanskritists and Indologists, by Indologists we mean people who wanted to study India, and in the beginning, it was done and primarily through the medium of Sanskrit texts and trying to study them and trying to come up with a chronology and a history of various changes that had taken place. So soon afterwards, by the middle of the 19th century, the European scholars concluded or decided that from now on, it's the Europeans who would decide for us Indians as to what these texts mean. So in other words, they said, we are going to be the interpreters of India, and we are not going to be listening to India's own interpretations, or we are not going to give it any value. And so this is the big scandal, because as recently two scholars who are based in America and Europe, but of Indian origin, Vishwa Adluri and Joydeep Bagchi, wrote a book on it called The Nay Science, where they go into the details of this European conceit that it's only they who have the right to interpret Indian texts. And so what they've done is they've said that this is what Indian texts mean, and we don't care what Indians themselves say about what these texts are. And therefore, Indians should look up to us for approval. So in fact, this is something that was set up by them. And I suppose Indians over the past 100 or 120 years have internalized it so much so that they do go back and ask people in Europe or America now, hey, is this correct or is this not correct? Even though when they talk to their own grandmothers and grandparents, the picture that they're told is entirely different. And there were two specific items in which all this became very important. And these items were used to justify European rule of India or English rule of India. One was that Indians cannot rule themselves because they have this phenomenon of caste, which is totally inflexible, where the whole society is broken up into these stratified layers. And therefore, you need a judge from outside who's from outside of the system to adjudicate, and that's why we need the British. So this is one. And of course, this is all totally false, because India had lineages, jatis, which are not different from similar lineages in other Asian countries or even in European countries. And as we know, there was a lot of mixing, etc., which always goes on. Now one difference that did crop up in India, which was unique perhaps to the Indian experience, was that during British rule, India's share of the world economy shrank from about 20 to 25% around the end of the 18th century to as low as 1.4% at the beginning of the First World War. So the 19th century was this period of extreme impoverishment of India. And in that period, as Indian arts and crafts and textiles were shut down because the English, first of all, created huge tariffs on Indian textiles when they couldn't compete with it. But when mechanization occurred after the Industrial Revolution, they used India just to sell their products, and therefore Indian products could not compete. And that's when these communities, which were not very different from similar communities elsewhere in the world, sort of drew within themselves, and it was all a question of how to survive. For most people, all that there was that one could get were jobs either in the army, in the police, and there were very small departments, say revenue or medicine, because they also destroyed India's own medical system. So there were not too many jobs. So what one could aspire to be was to perhaps become a cook, a Maharaj in somebody else's family. And the other thing was, of course, science. So they said India didn't have sciences, which is, of course, totally false. India had the most advanced sciences until the scientific revolution, which is the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. So, but they stuck to it. So they created the Indian Scientific and Education Service. And I believe in 1920, there were a total of 215 staff of the Indian Scientific and Education Services, of which 195 were English. So there were only about 20 Indians on that, because their claim was that Indians were to be taught all this. And now look at what's happened to world science, and you go to any university department or college across the world and you find Indians everywhere. So clearly this was like many other things which came up as a product of what the Indologists did. This was all imagined, but Indians have sadly internalized it, and perhaps political independence wasn't as hard a challenge. What is a greater challenge is for India to decolonize its minds. So Indians have this huge challenge facing them, and I believe initiatives such as yours, Jaipur Dialogues, is a part of that process of decolonizing minds. And of course, now with the social media, there are other avenues outside of the college and the university, which is still sort of led by old books, which are certainly not valid anymore, which have been reprinted or rehashed based on third-hand information. So the challenge is being met more outside, and of course also in scholarly journals and articles, where scholars do know that a lot of what the Indologists talked about and what they presented as story of India was wrong.
Correct. And I would request our viewers to please like, share, and subscribe this video, and also keep firing your questions, because Professor Kak has very graciously agreed to take all your questions, and it's a very rare occasion, so please do not miss it. Professor Kak, you also said that this was a racist enterprise, right?
Yes, why, you have open-minded people in the West, and Indian scholars in science, for example, great scholars of the 20th century, such as J.C. Bose and S.N. Bose or Srinivas Ramanujan and Meghanath Saha and many, many others. When they presented their work to European and American scholars, they were embraced, with open arms, because in science, excepting for a very small minority, most people are open-minded, as they should be, because science is universal. But sadly, the social sciences and history and other subjects were used as a vehicle, as an instrument of political control, an instrument of exercise of power. And to that extent, there were two parties. There was India and there was Europe on the other side. So Europe wanted to dominate India because, after all, as we all know, India was the source of a lot of the wealth that the British gained in the 19th century and became a world power. It's been estimated by economists that the British stole about $45 trillion from India. And the 19th century, in the name of that memorable title of the book, Late Victorian Holocaust, was characterized in India by so many famines in which millions of people died. And there were these famines also in Bengal before or during the Second World War, that even though there had been enough agriculture produce, Churchill let people in Bengal die, many people die, so that he could guarantee that as far as his war fighting soldiers, etc., the supplies to them were concerned, even though there was no shortage, that there was plenty for them at the expense of the people, which was clearly a kind of a racist thing to do. So it was a racist enterprise. And subsequent to that, I can tell you that there has been this effort to show that Indian astronomy and other mathematical sciences were actually created in Babylon and Greece, and they were brought to India after Alexander, or maybe in the first 2 or 3 centuries of our common era. And in order to show that, they came up with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that if there is anything to be found in the Indian texts which is not to be found in Babylonian or Greek texts, then it should be taken as evidence of lost Greek or Babylonian science, even though in their own languages there is no evidence of this sort. And there were many, many papers written on it in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, based on evidence which later on a certain text which is called Yavana Jatak, which was dated to 270 CE at that time, which now we have come to realize, because another copy of it has been found in Nepal, that was totally wrong. That was sort of put on it or foisted on it just to prove the theory that all of Indian sciences are to be traced back to Babylon or to Greece. So this Greek centrism or Eurocentrism was used to explain everything in India. And you can't do it, because not only do you have Aryabhat, who was certainly much more advanced as an astronomer than anybody else at that time, or you have Brahmagupta in the 7th century, whose mathematics and algebra was amazing. Then you have Bhaskaracharya much later, of course, who also speaks of a universal law of gravitation, because what he says, and this is, of course, a great conceptual advance. He didn't have the mathematical equations of gravitation, namely inverse square law, but he came up with the fact that you have objects in space because there is gravitation acting on them from other objects, which is why they don't fall on Earth. So he came up with an explanation for why objects don't fall on Earth, which is something that the Europeans could not do until gravitation law. So there was, of course, all of this, and then you had the Kerala School of mathematics and astronomy, which was far ahead, which also had infinite series, which is normally seen as the beginning of the scientific revolution, going to Newton and Leibniz. But in Kerala School of Mathematics, you already had that about 3 centuries prior. So all of these theories that somehow Indians are deficient, which is why if there is something in India, we must go to Europe or we must go to Greece. So that is clearly racist, because the moment you say this, and now the fact that that's not true is that, as we all know, Indians are the most successful community in the US, where we have a level playing field. Indians are successful in all kinds of fields. So for anybody to come up with such a hypothesis as a beginning of their attempts to relate to another culture is truly reprehensible. So what was done was reprehensible. And what is even more reprehensible is for the smart people in India, the Indian elite, who have been educated in the Western system, to have internalized it, which is why you have the horrendous kind of stories that we have right now. I was watching some program or some writing by somebody, a leading Indian journalist, who saw this this conflict between the Aryans and the Dravidians playing out in the Vamana avatar of Vishnu, putting his head on Mahabali's head and suggesting that Mahabali was Dravidian, when it was pointed out to him that he had a choti and he was wearing a janeu and so on. So people don't pay any attention to that at all. It has nothing to do with that, or the whole story about Mahishasur Mardani, Durga, and so on. It uh, it communicates such illiteracy or such lack of education. There's a phrase for it that was used by Jonathan Swift in one of his essays. He called it that what we face is a confederacy of dunces. Here are people who have college degrees and who keep on repeating things year after year. When the cycle comes in, when various cultural things are up out there during different festivals, they go out and speak of things which are so ridiculous that it's almost even one is ashamed even to acknowledge it. I think the great Sri Lankan Indologist. Now, I'm using the term Indologist in a positive term now. The great scholar, Ananda Kumaraswamy, he wrote a famous essay in 1943, and it's called Hinduism and Buddhism. And in fact, it's on the internet. You can download it. In that, he begins in the very first page. He says, almost anything that is being said by European scholars in the previous 200 years on Hinduism is false, that there is nothing that is true, and all that they've said it, and all that Indian scholars who have followed these Western scholars using the same Western methods, what they've also said is false. In fact, I would urge all of you to read this great essay. And sadly, after Ananda Kumaraswamy's warning almost 80 years ago, these tropes have been sort of repeated by India's leading scholars. By leading scholars, I mean people who have held leading positions in Indian universities. And the reason why they have repeated them is because none of them has gone to the original text. What has happened, sadly, to Indian scholarship is that these interpretations, if you will, which arose in Europe in the 19th century, and they were argued from with a certain background that people had, but lack of understanding. These people, many of these Western scholars had read Indian texts, but Indian scholars themselves have not read these texts, and they kept on repeating it. And those who are aware of these texts marvel, what's wrong with this country? What's wrong with this country of 1.3 billion people, that we cannot even have a sufficient number, which is not to say everybody. There are great Indian scholars also. Gopinath Kaviraj, for example, comes to mind, and many, many others. But by and large, one's talking of the general trend of Western educated scholars is a very sad story.
Oh, well, yes, I quite agree, because the most exalted historians in the Indian academia In medieval history, it is Irfan Habib who's on record saying that he doesn't know either Arabic or Persian, and he is a scholar of medieval history. So you can imagine what original text he could have read. And the most celebrated scholar in the last 70 years in our what is called the academic dystopia that we created under the Marxist influence was Romila Thapar, who did not know Sanskrit and who was a scholar of ancient Indian history. So, what you say is absolutely correct. That also brings me to your statement, or rather, you have a full subtitle there. It says that first hubris and then scandal. And you quoted Fritz Stahl and his book called Discovery of Vedas or Discovery of Vedic Teachings, where he comes out with some fantastic theories. So we'd like to hear from you what kind of phantasmagoria these people were building up.
Okay, first of all, Fritz Stahl, he did some excellent work on the grammatical tradition. He came down to Chennai for his PhD, and he learned Paninian system, etc. And he went back and he told European scholars that, look, Chomsky is the great rage. You know, Chomsky was this guy who came up with deep structure and so on, grammatical structure, and it had some implications for computer science as well. So he was probably the most famous, or one of the most famous scholars or intellectuals in the world in the late 20th century. So Fritz Stahl went back and he said that, look, Panini had done something similar much earlier. So he did some wonderful work. He published some books, including an edited book published on grammatical tradition, published by MIT Press. So he did great work. But later on, somehow, the pressure on, especially in ancient Indian studies, where the Europeans want to keep on maintaining their hegemony, because some of them have been on record saying, and this is in public lectures, they're saying that we don't want to give Indian Sanskritists a place at the table. We are going to be deciding. And in fact, one of the most offensive scholars whom I know personally, many years ago, he told me, he says that, look, we decide how all of this is going to be interpreted. We decide what the Vedas are. Indians don't have a place out there. So I guess under a lot of pressure, at a certain point when he has retired, he went to Thailand. He was a professor at Berkeley, and I'm all praise for him for the work that he had done. And in fact, before he left for Thailand, he sent me his own personal copy of a book he wrote called The Stamps of Jammu and Kashmir. That was his last copy. And it was a book which was published, a very limited edition. So he sent it to me. He says, Subhash, you would have some value for it. So he went back, then he wrote something where he was suggesting that only he, as a European, because Europe's languages are probably not as separated from Vedic Sanskrit, and Vedic Sanskrit is so separated from classical Sanskrit, so that Indians don't have that capacity or instrumentality to interpret the Vedic text. Because ultimately, it's all a fight for the Vedas. The Europeans want to say that the Vedas were theirs, and Vedas have some wonderful stuff. Why? Because everybody in the world, all the great scholars and scientists and artists, they say there's nothing like the Upanishads. You have Schopenhauer, you have Nietzsche, you have Heisenberg, you have Schrodinger, everybody saying that Upanishads are the greatest. Well, they say Upanishads are the heart of the Vedas. But then they want to say that the Vedas are ours. So Vedas were brought to India, and then this whole caste stuff of the Indians and their mushiness, because they couldn't think straight, they got absorbed in all this religiosity and all the ritual and so on. So then after that, after the Europeans came to India and they brought their Vedas, which are really European, then India has been a sad story. India has been a tragic story, and India needed Europeans to to release them, to show them the way. So the British came. They did this for 150 years, and now, of course, the British had to leave because of whatever the world historical geopolitical situation. But now, fortunately, we have brown Indians who are British in everything, but the color of their skin, who will show them the way. So they are our allies. It's sort of ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that one can only laugh. One doesn't know whether to laugh or cry.
This is the classical extension of the Aryan invasion theory,
Right, right.
which they have now. They first changed to the Aryan migration theory, and now with the because they could not support it by any other science, so ultimately they found refuge in the genetics, and now even the genetics is betraying them. So they are now probably going to call it the Aryan tourism theory or something like that.
No, it is so, Sanjay ji, it's so bizarre. The theory that some people seriously propose, they say it was just men because they say, you know, you have XY and XX chromosomes. The men came in as fighters or whatever, and then they intermarried with the locals. All right, let's concede that as a hypothesis. So they intermarried with the locals because India was the most densely populated region of the ancient world. So let's concede this. So the men came in, so they intermarried and they were fighters, etc., etc. But then their children, who were raised by their mothers, who were local Indians, you know, old Indians, not the Aryans, they adopted the language wholesale, that there is no evidence of anything else, because that doesn't really happen. You look at Afghans who came to India, or Kashmiris who came to UP. In 2 generations, they're forgotten their Kashmiri, right? You go to if you are a minority, you go to a large, densely populated region, you lose your language. And then, so there is no mechanism that they can explain their own theory by. It is, all I can say is it's this attachment to this racist vision that we have to see India as the other. India is the other, which was then civilized by Europe. And we have to see it again and again in literature. We have to see it in sciences. And now, of course, they can't understand why is it that these Indians are doing so well wherever they are, whether they are in Europe, whether they're in America. Some of the most creative people are Indian. So they can't understand it. Now they say sometimes that maybe it's our system. You have come in here, now you're civilized, now we can do well. You know, it's truly bizarre. Oh, that's all I can say.
Yes, so you go on to discuss academic Indology in your article, and then you discuss Herman Oldenburg and his bizarre theories of Hindu gods, and then you also talk about Indologists who found Indian art as grotesque, and also about how Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, they found likeness with Athena, Apollo, and Dionysius, not the other way around. And what do you call epistemicide and the Cartesian extension of I think, therefore I am. All these things you discuss under the head academic Indology. I think our viewers would benefit if you dilate on this a little bit.
Well, there are always prejudices. Every academic is attached to the paradigm that he's trained in. So that is perfectly reasonable. You know, you have a lot of academics and they are all pushing their own ideas, and there is a struggle between ideas, and then the next generation latches on to what they think is most reasonable. So that is perfectly fine. But what has happened is, so in other words, I'm totally for total free discussion of all kinds of ideas and debate and challenging whatever the previous generation may have believed in. You must always challenge it, because there are no permanence in thought. But the biases that have emerged because of the centralization of scholarship in India, and I think that arose in part the Faustian bargain that Mrs. Gandhi entered in the 1970s with the left, so that the left had total control over who is going to be hired and who is going to be promoted or what brand of history is going to be discussed. Now, this didn't happen in all fields. For example, if you look at history of science, in history of science, people were open, and most good people, most good scholars in the West are totally open as well. There are wonderful, wonderful scholars in the West who look at facts as what they are. But sadly, in history, because history was a instrument for politics, for control, it was used for that purpose. So they biased and prejudiced people in Europe who held on to their racist views. This is not the best scholars. This is probably the worst scholars. Found partners within India. Within India, those who have internalized that colonialist view of India. So there was this wonderful partnership. They were in bed together. And that's why it happened. And that's why these people found that this was one way of fighting their enemy, which is these people with these regressive views who were a drag on India's progress. So we are not going to kill them physically. We're going to kill all their ideas that there are. And we are not going to give a place to their views at the academic table. And so this is what some Mexican scholars have called epistemicide. You want to destroy the epistemology associated with the group that you have conquered, which Europe has conquered. And Europe has tried to do in all parts of the world. And so this is what happened. And we see this, for example, in a project called Wikipedia, which on the surface is a wonderful thing that anybody can edit it, but in reality has become a vehicle to reinforce these Eurocentric anti-Indian views, because they might say everybody can edit it, but then they have their own editors on top of the volunteers who make sure that what doesn't meet with their approval gets reverted, right? So I think this is something that has happened, and people in politics are aware that there is always, in the exercise of power, an attempt to destroy the other side, if not physically, destroy all their ideas or destroy their stories. This happens also, as we know, in religion, in conversion. There's a famous book which came out a couple of years ago called The Darkening Age. It speaks of Europe after it became Christianized, in the first few centuries after 400 CE or so, how the new converts destroyed all evidence that there was of the previous culture and civilization. All sculptures were destroyed or defaced. Books were burnt and destroyed. Ancient temples were destroyed. In fact, the only old ancient temple that there is still standing is the Pantheon, which was an old pagan temple, and then the church occupied it. That's the only ancient temple that survives. In fact, how is Europe connected to its past? Not through its own books, which were destroyed, through the books which the Muslims translated into Arabic. And after the new birth, so to speak, Renaissance, 4 or 5 centuries ago, these books were retranslated back into Europe. But just imagine how complete the destruction was. It was like the destruction that has also taken place in India, because in India there was, great texts. India has probably the most untranslated texts even now, millions of these texts which people haven't looked at. So there was a similar attempt, and there is a similar attempt going on even now, by ensuring that all of these texts are sidelined. And what hurts the colonialists and their collaborators in India is that, India has come back center stage. Go to any corner of the world, people are doing yoga, and they're doing yoga not only for the asanas, although that might be the initial step, attraction for them, but they want to ask the next question: who am I? What is my mind? Because India was not only ahead in mathematical, astronomical, or logical sciences, Navya and all that, India was certainly ahead and is still ahead in the inner sciences. And inner sciences are the future of science. Inner sciences is where you go from psychology, from neuroscience. You want to ask where awareness comes from, where consciousness comes in from physics also. The whole question of where is the observer? You have the outside world, the mechanical world, but where is the observer comes in? Where does the observer come in from? And that's where, in my view, India still has a lot to teach. And this is what hurts tremendously the confederacy of dunces that we have, which is constantly attacking everything superficially because they don't really know what there is. I would tell them, please don't be judgmental without looking at the evidence. Look at the evidence, and if you hate it, then hate it, and we'll be with you. But don't dismiss it. You're only hurting yourself because the whole world is ready right now. The whole world is excited about all of this. You go anywhere in the West is very worried or what will happen if computers were to become conscious. And if they don't become conscious, why won't they become conscious? Where are the answers to these questions? And the greatest Manishis, the greatest scholars of the West are saying, yes, Vedanta is where the greatest thought to all of these questions has been given. So let's know what it is. And so we do it with an open mind. So what I'm telling your listeners is that as Indians, you are first of all connected to it through your culture, but you are totally free and perfectly within your rights to dismiss it and walk away and say we hate it, right? We hate such and such things. For India, we want to embrace the West completely, and that's perfectly right for anybody to do. But at least give it a try. Find out what it is. Don't go to the worst of India as being representative of it. What is done is that you set up this straw man. You say that this is what India is because somebody in this ritual, they do this stupid stuff. No, don't go to the very best and then reject what you don't like, what you don't find aesthetically pleasing. But there is so much. Don't throw out all this wonderful stuff because you're only hurting yourself.
Quite right. I think this scare is what prompts these people to try and do academic control. I remember in Jaipur dialogues, we examined this and we said that this Aryan invasion theory, how did it become a theory at all? Any of the classical methodologies that are followed in establishing a theory have not been followed. It's just somebody said it, that, okay, this happened, so it's more like an axiom, which has not been proved. So we said, okay, anybody who proves this Aryan invasion theory, we instituted an award, people kept contributing, rather people kept pledging, and the purse has now grown to rupees 2.1 crore. And you would be surprised, there isn't a single claim. I mean, there isn't even a single inquiry. And I would urge you that you can spread this word. I think 2.1 crore is substantial even by American standards. Somebody may be impelled to come and prove it. So,
Sanjayji, the other point is all this Aryan invasion theory is distraction. What is India? India's culture and civilization has things to offer, has insights to offer. The Aryan invasion theory was used as a distraction by the colonialists to turn the gaze away from the subject, because what they said was you're going to be taught such and such subjects, which had become a part of the curriculum. So they sidelined all of Indian shastras and sciences. You see that? So they said they just chose that we are going to talk of this and this and this. And sadly, that is still happening. There is a lecture by Dalai Lama somewhere and I think I have a link to that in this particular article, where he says that Western psychology is like kindergarten compared to Indian psychology, Indian sciences, right? Yes. Yoga and so on. But in spite of that, where in India, in any college or university, do they teach Indian psychology? We don't. We are still fighting to find a place at the table because the colonization of our minds is so complete. The freedom from the colonization of minds is such a bigger challenge than what has been achieved, that we have miles to go. And by doing this, we are only hurting ourselves, and examples of that are legion all over. India has almost no products. Indian programmers are not amongst the top in the world, because what do? We have absorbed this false statement that we can do sciences only through English, that all our young people, all our youth have to first, even in villages, have to first learn English before they can learn computer science, before they can learn programming. We are hurting ourselves. Why are we doing it? There is time. All this should be junk thrown out. Computer science should be taught through every Indian language. We should emphasize, or we should let every youth open to knowledge through their own mother tongue, and then they can learn English also, or any other language. So we are not doing what common sense would ask anybody to do. We are depending on theoreticians, or these people who live in their offices. They really have no understanding of how the real world works. They say, well, English is our advantage because English is international language. This is all totally false. We are hurting ourselves with every such policy.
I recently did an interview with Vijay Lakshmi Vishwanathan. She's a remarkable lady. And she graduated from Wharton and was an MBA, well settled and with a very good job. And she took her children to Chennai and homeschooled them in the ancient Gurukula method. And today, they are the top in their classes, in their courses, in Stanford and Georgetown universities. It's such a remarkable example. Now, actually, I'm also trying to associate with them, and Augusta Gurukulam is an initiative by them. It's such a remarkable story. I think if people do not get inspired by this, what else will inspire them? And the way they teach them mathematics through Leelavati, where they do not only learn mathematics, but they also learn the language, they learn the grammar, they learn the meter. Just imagine what kind of a lyrical experience and a wholesome experience the child gets, and what kind of a wholesome personality he develops in the end. So those kind of examples are there. I think we need to multiply them. Also, I would request you to help us formulate a group, which I am planning, because of this new education policy. There's going to be a lot of changes in syllabus. The syllabi are going to be rewritten. The texts are going to be rewritten. We are also trying to encourage and persuade the Union Public Service Commission to change their syllabus. So all these efforts will be there. So we will definitely be taking guidance from you there. Now I come to the end of this discussion, the final question, and again reminding our viewers and especially our subscribers from abroad, please do help us grow by contributing to us, and do keep sharing, subscribing, and liking these videos, and do keep asking these questions. I think we don't have enough questions as yet, and I'm finishing these discussions in the next couple of minutes. There is this question. I mentioned that academic control, and you also mentioned in this article that they need to control Sanskrit studies. I think you already alluded to it a little bit. And then you ended this article beautifully with Atma Vidya and delusion. So I think today's discussion also we can end on that note.
Oh, absolutely. It's delusion when you are not properly informed, you don't know your own self, and somebody else tells you that this is what the facts are. That's what delusion is. Some moha, for example, is delusion. So, but on a positive note, there are also opportunities. The higher education system all over the world is in a great state of crisis. You can use technology now, such as your channel and do it in new ways, which we still have to think of, maybe a vehicle for Atmavidya and all the other sciences that India has, the Shastras, which are still relevant, because a lot of that stuff is a part of standard curriculum. If you look at mathematics, for example, that is a part of standard curriculum. That's wonderful. We're not rejecting anything. We embrace all sciences, but all Western sciences or all contemporary sciences exclude Atmavidya. And Atmavidya is going to be the key to the self-understanding of the artist, of the scientist, of the informed person, to know as to how to navigate through all the uncertainty of the future, because the future is going to be uncertain for a variety of reasons. The world has become a global village. There is also pressures between various nations because there is a tremendous imbalance. There is one nation which is producing for everybody else, and that cannot continue for too long. And likewise, colleges and universities have become too expensive, so we have to use new technology. So this is the perfect place for wise people to pool their resources and see what kind of a platform should we create, so that one doesn't necessarily only have to go to Stanford or Georgetown or Harvard or wherever else. You would have access to all this remarkable wisdom and education wherever you are. And maybe we could also have means to provide certification. In fact, I think Amazon and Google are also also getting into the university education by certifying skills. So we need platform, and there may be business opportunities out there for India to once again become a kind of a Vishwa Guru, create this and offer it to people all over the world, because open-minded, good people in every culture and civilization, in every corner of the world, are searching for truth. They are open. They don't care where it comes from. So if we have something to offer, and we have a lot to offer, we should see what we can do to scale up projects or initiatives such as yours, such as Jaipur Dialogues, scale it up to a level so that it is able to make a fundamental difference to people in India and elsewhere as well.
That was great. It's amazing insight. Now we go to the question answer session, and questions will be flashed on the screen. So the first question is by Rajat Dhingra. Should we launch a massive project of researchers reading every book on historical topics and connect the dots while using big data to point out inconsistency and rewrite our history to end confusions?
Well, some of that is already being done by scholars, good scholars. What we need is more scholars. India has a lot of colleges and universities, but perhaps not enough of those scholars are actually doing work as diligently as they should. Just to give you an example, look at Sanskrit itself. We know, or linguists know, that a Western language is very similar to late Vedic Sanskrit of Atharva Veda period. So, and as we know, from a Western came Eastern Iranian languages, and from there came Persian, right? And so Sanskrit scholars should also be looking at a Western. We should not just be looking at Sanskrit itself. We also should be looking at how Sanskrit already in the past has transformed the ancient world. Not just the Persian world, we also have the Slavic languages. And you go back to the Slavic world of the Russians, the Serbians, the Ukrainians, and you find that before they became Christianized about 1000 CE, they worshipped Vedic gods. Their chief god was Parjanya, whom they called Perconus. And they had gods with many arms and so on, just like Indian gods. So we need Sanskrit scholars and historians just not to be doing only India. That is important enough, I admit, but also go out. You have to enlarge, expand. You have to make the whole world, as the greater India that it was, because after all, India was not only what is currently political India, but it was all of Southeast Asia, which was called Deepantaram, right? The whole archipelago of islands, or Suvarna Bhumi, which was Thailand, or Indra Bhumi, which was Myanmar, and so on, and China through Xinjiang, which was where Indic languages were spoken until 1000. So we want Indian scholars also to change or take their exertions to stuff which was outside of India and see all those ancient connections, which will be helpful to people in these lands also to reconnect to their own past, where inner sciences were given more value. Because everybody wants to go to inner sciences. That is because we do know the outer world fairly well from the modern sciences. And that's where India has so many lessons still to teach to the world.
Okay, next question. Okay, Vidya Amirapu. Why cannot Government of India HRD Ministry hold a mega Indology conference with the Indic scholars like yourselves? Thank you for the good work you're doing.
Well, there are meetings that happen. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube, a lot of Zoom things. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. But ultimately, you can't only depend on the government. I think in India, the government's role is more than what it should be. It is very important, and certainly the new education policy is going to be a very important change from how things have been done in the past. But I think the time has also come for people who are outside of the government, scholars, individual scholars, to take charge, or even temples. Because temples in the past, until 200-300 years ago, before the British came, were also centers of education. And as we know from the work of Dharampal ji, the literacy rate before the British came, and all people from all jatis, kids from all jatis participated, was about 60 to 70%. By the time the British left, India's literacy had plunged to 12%. So now we have these colleges and universities. We need to think of new institutions which are led by not the government, by the private sector, or by individuals. Who can take the lead? Because sometimes the government, by its very nature, is slower at action than what private institutions can be. And maybe what we need to do, and Sanjay ji may have certain pointers here. You have new great temples such as the Ram Janmabhoomi temple coming up. Why not also provide another side to these great temples, which are education and research? All the great temples, there are many great temples in Rajasthan itself. Why don't they revive research where people can do their PhD or become acharyas or whatever, and have a certification system across all these temples, where which would accredit these degrees, and eventually people with such degrees could also find jobs. So I think people have to think outside of the box and see what can be done. And this is something that is done in America, for example. These seminaries and religious organizations and centers have their own accreditation process. And it doesn't have to be necessarily only religious. It could be sort of independent, because after all, Bharatiya Sanskriti is not religious in a limited sense. It is universal knowledge. The inner knowledge is universal, really. So how do we create institutions which would be able to become the madhyam, the medium, to take it to the larger population? And also all those who are seekers, who want to learn, they can then be a part of this, be connected to acharyas at some of these temples, so that these temples are not only in the service of the Ishta Devata, they are also in the service of Sanatan Dharma as universal knowledge. So I think something could be done, and maybe Rajasthan and maybe Sanjay ji could take the leadership in that.
We'll certainly try and see what we can do. Next question is, do you think because so much was stolen from India by the European, there was a big effort to rewrite original Indian texts to confuse Indians? I think
I
you
don't Yeah, I don't believe in conspiracies. The Europeans were trying to do their best with their understanding at that time. They didn't understand the Vedas, for example. They thought, and in that there was some tradition within India which also saw the Vedic deities as more and as nature forces, right? Which is, of course, a very superficial, which is a adibhotic reading, not the adhyatmic reading. Now, of course, any sage in India, any rishi in India would say, yeah, you can look at a story in a outer sense, in a adibhotic sense, but there is a deeper thing, which is the adhyatmic thing. So these Western scholars, because they had no tradition of their own related to adhyatma, so they latched on to the outer stories, and then they were trying to do their best. I think we should give the benefit of the doubt to everybody. We should trust the sincerity of everybody. So they gave it a interpretation which they thought made sense. I don't think there was a conspiracy to confuse anybody. It's up to us to seize the narrative and say that this is what it is, because this is what we have learned from our acharyas, from our grandmothers, from our grandparents, from other people within our tradition, and this is what it is. And this is what our texts also say us. This, you go to Yaska's Nirupta, and he says, of course, you can look at the outer story, but that's not what it is. It's the adhyatma, which is
I
really
think
the
you
heart.
could explain you could explain the difference in meaning, taking the example of your piece on the first shloka of the Rig Veda.
Right, right. I mean, it's not the Agni. Agni is also our speech. Agni is also speech. It opens this entire world that here, what the Rig Veda is talking about, as of course, Aurobindo also in his famous book, The Secret of the Veda, tried very hard to communicate. And there are many Western scholars also who are trying to get connected to it. And so this is a time, rather than worry about why did people do it, was there a conspiracy? I won't say there was a conspiracy. I would say that this is what they thought at that time with their limited understanding. But now, why should we still be teaching the same wrong stuff in our text? We should stand up and say, enough is enough. Let's move on. And this is what it really means. Not because we are making it up, because this is what our own adhyatmic parampara has told us over millennia, over thousands of years. And this is what modern rishis like Sri Aurobindo and scholars in the West as well, who want to connect to this tradition, are telling us. So let's be empowered. Why are we not empowering the next generation of our own? We are telling them false stuff. Why?
Right.
We should empower them, send them out to the world, and then they will transform the world.
Right. Next question. This is okay. Professor Kak is an accomplished researcher. How did you balance between CS research and Indology? How to balance research life and tackle the publish or perish culture of academia? Please guide. Interesting question.
Interesting question. There are two ways to live this world. One is in perpetual fear of wanting to do what everybody expects you to do. In that case, you will never come by true insights. At some point, you have to give ahuti of yourself. As one of the other mantras in the Vedas tells us, the only way to live life is to be a warrior. I wrote a column on it just 2 days ago called "The Office Seeker and the Warrior," and I started off with Anand
Yes,
Kumar
I
Swami, and I spoke about Aurobindo as well. India has become a nation of office seekers. As an office seeker, you only want to, publish, and publishing is not bad. That's wonderful too. And if you have found that flow, then do it. Wonderful, right? But do it if you feel that urge. You have to have that drive within you. And if you have that drive, you are prepared to be a warrior. You are prepared to die. As a warrior, you don't know whether you're going to survive this battlefield. Once you are prepared to do that, then all kinds of capacities become available to you. There are these stories of how this mama bear, and she's attacked, and she's small, and she's attacked by these lions, and she has this fury. The lions retreat. They know that they can't deal with her. So if you really believe in yourself, you will have capacities that you don't know existed. And I think that's how we should live life. We shouldn't live life only as office seekers. We have to do some of that as pragmatic people, as real people. You also have to provide for your family. You are connected to your family. All those things are important. You have to be prudent, but not give up everything so that now you're living only for the office. I think then you are losing this great precious gift that life is. This life is given to us as a gift for us to discover all the marvels that are our true destiny. So we must be inspired. That is what Gayatri Mantra is, for example. We must obtain that prerana and be connected to that flow that is within us. And that's when we would know what our life is truly for. And if you do that, I can tell you that all these difficulties between CS and Indology, etc., they just fall away. You are doing what you are. There are people all over the world who are unprejudiced, who are open-minded, who would value whatever you're doing.
All right. Next question. DPS Jadon. By end of 17th century, West took a giant leap in scientific and industrial revolution, which was very backward till 16th century. Do you think they have taken many theories from our ancient text and sciences?
Well, what I praise the West for then and what I praise the West for now is udyam, is energy. For the West, for many centuries, was in a state of religious darkness. And then when the scientific revolution took place, or before that, the Renaissance, then people said, we want to get connected to our past. We want to know what our own ancients did, the Greeks, for example, who were open-minded. And so then they looked at other cultures and civilizations also. Napoleon, when he went to Egypt, he also had Champollion with him. They wanted to read ancient Greek hieroglyphics. So that is the culture which has helped them. And that is the culture of energy, udyam, that we need to be connected to. And not just be connected to our own thing. We need to go out, open-minded, curious. Because only when you are curious about everything will the Devi smile at you. That is when Saraswati will speak through you. Because Saraswati, Saras, which makes everything easy, where your mind is calm, like a pond, they calm. That's when all things come. So I don't blame the West for whatever it did. It wanted to connect to the sciences, and they took whatever they could. And now we are discovering, for example, now Vaisheshika Sutras, that Kannada also had laws of motion, not all the three. Two of the three laws of motion are there clearly in Kannada's Vaisheshika Sutras. So why don't our scholars, our physicists also make an attempt to be connected to Kannada? I'm not even saying that you have to be connected to Kannada. If you don't like Kannada, if you don't like Sanskrit, if you don't like India for whatever reason, get connected to Aristotle or connected to Plato or whatever. Be curious and have energy, have udyam. If you have energy, you have curiosity, wonderful things will happen. And let's forget about recriminations. Why did Europeans did what they did? That's all past. We are all equal now. Let's just march on, because the challenges that exist in modern world are as major because of the dangers or the challenges of AI, of machines which do what we do, what's going to happen to society. These challenges are as big or even worse than the challenges that humanity faced 2 or 3 centuries ago. So let's not keep on looking at the past. Let's stand up tall. Let's draw ourselves up. Let's be connected to our past, because in my view, knowing, as somebody who knows Western history and Western past, also quite well. I know the Greek stuff, the Roman stuff, the European stuff. I can tell you, I like the Western civilization as well, and culture as well, and their literature. But there is nothing in the world, there's nothing as extraordinary as our own tradition, as our own parampara. So let's celebrate it, and let's be strengthened by it. Let's become prevailed by it and move on. And then if we do that, we'll have wonderful things to share with everybody on earth.
All right, next question. Bharat Ved Prakash. Is economic success of India necessary to win back the Indic narrative with regards to our civilization? World doesn't take us seriously because we are poor.
It's partly true. It's in general, people don't take those who are not successful seriously. And that was a big challenge that confronted India after independence, because people said, hey, why can't you do well? Why can't you do better than what you're doing? But things have already changed. India, in purchasing power parity terms, India is already the world's third largest economy, although on a per capita basis, we are far behind. But as a nation, we are not as badly off now as was the case, say, 70 years ago. So Indians are being taken seriously also for their inner knowledge all over the world, for their adhyatmic knowledge. Every country of the world, people are doing yoga. They're doing yoga even in their bedrooms in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. Everybody wants to, know who they are, because now there are all these images on TV and movies and this and that. And so these are the questions that confront the world. So people are, in fact, taking us seriously. What we need to do, it's not that people are not paying us attention, but we need to stand up and tell the world clearly as to what India is. If we stand up and we talk about bizarre things like this, Vamana avatar putting his head because this is Aryans versus Dravidians, which is so ridiculous and bizarre, being spoken by people who don't know anything. People don't take those Indians seriously who think they are westernized, who are speaking good English, and then they go and Westerners see through them in a minute, and they know that they are putting up this front, and they don't take them seriously. They take those Indians seriously, whether they don't even have to know English. English is just a language. It's just one medium. You can use so many different media, so many different languages. They take sincere Indians, whether they know English or not, seriously. And these people are listened to. And it's some of these Indians who don't know English, who have gone to European countries, they've gone to Czechia, they've gone to Moscow, they've gone to Norway, and they have become yoga teachers, and they're speaking to them in their language from heart to heart, and people love them. These are the Indians who are making an impact. It's not Indians with degrees from Oxford and Cambridge or JNU who don't know India themselves, and they go and stand up and people see through them in a minute, and they're not taken seriously.
Right. So we have a lot of questions to go. So I would request you to go a little faster. I think we can deal with the question a little more briefly. So next question. Did ancient Indians lack the sense of history?
Girishji is absolutely right in a certain sense. I think where we went wrong was that we didn't write ordinary accounts of either the kings or all that was happening. There's only one or two or three accounts, like Raj Tarangani and the two subsequent Raj Taranganis from Kashmir. By and large, we didn't write about the past because, and that is a flaw. We should own it up. We should own it up. Now, of course, there were Sala Purans and there were other Purans, but they were all stories written for the ages about the ages. So I totally agree that was a shortcoming, and certainly in the modern era, we are making up for it, and people are writing about the current events of the last 40, 50 years. Lots of stories have been written, and that's for the good.
Okay. Next question is, Indian theoretical computer science community is largely leftist. Sometimes professors expect their own students, scholars to have the same view, anti-CAA stand, etc. How to save us? PhD in danger.
I think that's very sad. I think any good professor should not insist on any specific belief system for on the part of his student, and if they do, that means they're really not good professors. I think that's very sad if that is happening. The CAA thing, as we know from what has been happening in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, sadly, we do need to give refuge to people who cannot live in dignity in their own countries. So, without going into politics, I must say that uh, in the academic world itself, people should be open minded, and there should be room for all kinds of opinions, whether they are on the left or on the right, so long as they are human centric. We don't want to train students who are such regressive views that they should not be a part of any decent company. But leaving that aside, people should be free to believe in a whole spectrum of political positions, in my view.
Right. Next question. We always talk about Indian past being very rich in terms of knowledge and culture. Then how were outsiders successful in destroying us easily? What were our weaknesses and their strengths?
Well, history is such a complicated process. Nations go up and down for a variety of reasons, and sometimes these reasons are outside of uh, their own country. See, for example, when the Silk Route, which was trade between China and India and Europe, once the Turkish people captured it and the trade over that lessened, then the Europeans started trading by ship, and the power changed because as the trade over Central Asia lessened, the power equations changed because, after all, power comes from the amount of exchange that is taking place. Money is also the amount of exchange that is taking place. The more the exchange, more the wealth. So all these things go up and down. Now, we do know that all ancient civilizations had bad periods. Rome fell, Greece fell, Egypt fell, China fell as well. China was ruled by the Mongols for a couple of centuries, Kublai Khan and his descendants. And then last 200-300 years, it was ruled by the Manchurians, who were also a non-Chinese language speaking people. So all nations have had that as a part of their experience. In a way, one can say that India is one ancient civilization that has survived, because the mantras which were chanted 2000 or 3000 years ago on the banks of Ganga and Kaveri are still being chanted now. India is still connected to that past through language, through culture, through its way of doing things, through music, which other cultures are not. Egypt now is not the Egypt of the ancient times. Greece now is not the Egypt is the Greece of ancient times. There has been some continuity in China, but even there, it's not as complete as in India. So maybe India was not destroyed. Maybe India had devices which made its life persist, and it has bounced back. I think India as a culture and civilization is doing much better now than it was, say, 100 or 200 years ago. So India has bounced back, and India is everywhere. So I think we are not giving enough credit to ourselves. So maybe the way we dealt with those dangers at that time, because we were decentralized, so India could not be destroyed completely. And those regions of India got destroyed, which were centralized, where we had these monasteries, where learning was centralized, like Nalanda or Vikramshila and others, or Takshashila, where Indian wisdom was decentralized in the villages, etc., where it's persisted, it survived, and it has prospered. Because even the last 10 centuries, all kind of wonderful stuff has been done. You look at Bihar and Bengal, the Navi Nyaya tradition. You look at Vedanta, there have been great Vedantins. You look at Vishishta Advaita, you look at Dvaita and all of that stuff, the Madhvas and so on. So India has survived. And I think we should also sing praises to this great strength with which India has done well.
Okay, next question is directed to you. Why not people like you start programs on public platforms like YouTube?
I know that is big. This is a part of that. I'm on YouTube now, thanks to Sanjay ji. You need people to facilitate that process. But clearly, I think something wonderful is happening in India as well. And all these new technologies, social media, YouTube, should be a vehicle to spread the best of India. We should also acknowledge, just as we must acknowledge that there were perhaps not as much of emphasis on history of ordinary people, of kings as ordinary lives. So we should also acknowledge that whatever crept into our society where we did not value the universal, because I truly believe every human being is equal. Every human being, no matter what jati they come from, truly believe we are all equal. Every human being has the same purush, man, woman, child, no matter what their background is. We need to emphasize that. We need to use social media to emphasize that. And all that has been propagandized against us as a society, all stratified, that hierarchical, etc. That's all wrong. We need to throw that out of the window and take this message of perfect equality, of Atmavidya, of art, of this Gyan, to all corners of India. When all of India is awakened, the rest of the world will listen. No, there would be no stopping India, because there is no other culture and civilization which gives primacy to Atmavidya like India does. And this is the science of the future.
Yeah, quite right. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Samam Sarveshu Bhuteshu Tishtantam Parameshwaram. Next question. Can we start dialogue with good part of Bollywood and connect them to all of this info? Well, they have to be taken out of drugs first. This will be inspiring way of teaching youth in the world.
Absolutely. Why are people getting into drugs? Not just in Bollywood, but also in the West. They are getting into drugs because in their heart they feel what they've been told is not it, right? In the West, 60, 70,000 young people, smart people die of opioid poisoning because in their heart they feel a vacuum, right? They feel there is something missing. And what is that missing? That is this Atmavidya. So if in Bollywood there is this gap and people are unhappy, all that we have to tell them is that, look, we are not your enemies. We are not telling you something which is bizarre. Dismiss it, but first, for your own sake, give it a chance. Listen to it, and if you think it doesn't measure up, then walk away. If they do that, there'll be all kind of wonderful things, because where does creativity come from? Creativity in every human being comes from within. This infinite potential that every human being has, this purush that every human being has. If we were not to put this avaran around this so that we get disconnected from us, and that's when we are only connected in a mechanical way to others, right? That's where our mind is playing tricks on us. So for Bollywood also, to find its creativity, they need to be connected. Don't give it any name. If you don't like the word Hinduism, don't call it Hinduism. If you don't call it whatever, this is eternal, Shashwat knowledge. This is Sanatan Dharma. If you like that term, fine. So why don't you, it's like the most beautiful, this is like Amrit. If there is Amrit, why wouldn't you partake of it? If you partake of it, you would be able to have access to all kinds of creativity within you, which would be wonderful in such a liberating way, transforming way for everybody.
Right. Next question. Did ancient Indian lacks the sense of history? I think this has already been asked.
He had already asked this question. Yes, I remember his name.
Somebody else asked this question. I think this is the same repeat question. I think, Girish, you can take that same answer. And we move on to the next one. Unirider. I speak some Spanish, Catalan, and German as well. The connection with Sanskrit is obvious, like asti, estas, estes, pero parantu, donor, dana. I think this is an observation, so we can take this as an observation and move on. Next question. How to avoid cultural appropriation of art forms?
Well, I know it's a political issue, but on the other hand, if you're all one family, we should be open to all kind of experimentation. All by all meaning all of human beings are one family. And right now it's political because sadly, uh, uh, Western education has become too political. Western history, anthropology, sociology has become a story about resentments. And so when everything is being taught as resentments, you're talking about things. That's when you don't want things to be shared. But look, on the other hand, T.S. Eliot wrote his poem for which he won the Nobel Prize, his book of poems called The Wasteland. And one of his poems there is basically a copying of one of the passages from Brihad Aranyak Upanishad, which is called What the Thunder Said, right? Da, da, da. That the gods say da for damiyat, you control yourself. The asuras say da for daya, because the asuras can be very cruel. And humans say da, or the thunder is saying da for, on behalf of the humans, saying give danam, give charity, be share with others. So we also need to cross culturally, be connected to the transcendent. So I think some bit of cultural appropriation is a good thing, but we should of course honor the culture that we are taking it from and not look down upon it, which is probably what the problem is. Because I think in this current situation where a dominant society wants to show the other societies that they are inferior, you steal from them and then you look down upon them, which is horrible. Surely that should not happen. We should treat every culture with honor, because every culture is that culture's own way to connect to the mystery within themselves.
This is like the Nazi Aryan superiority, I guess. That's what they did. They appropriated from the Indians and they said we are superior to the rest of the Europe. Upender Vellore, India used to have great institutional knowledge. Nalanda, Takshila were famous worldwide. How can we build such institutions in modern context?
Well, there are some liberal arts colleges that are coming up in India lately, but they are also teaching Western great books. The point has been made. There are 100 great Western books, which is a part of a curriculum. There were similarly, several hundred great books in Nalanda or Takshashila, which a student came in and he learned at the feet of his teacher by not just listening to what he said, but also watching what he did. Sometimes that becomes a greater teaching lesson, not what somebody's saying, but what he's doing. So I think the challenge for modern India, and perhaps Sanjay ji can help us in there, you have new universities coming up, but they're really pale copies of Western colleges, in
Right.
my view. What we need is a university which is not turning its back to the West. We want, because as I've said in the past, we want to embrace the West as well, but which has a place for 100 great Indian texts. That if we did that, these texts could then be the medium through which Indians and others, because we are all a family, could be connected to this extraordinary parampara. And something needs to be done. We need to identify those 100 texts, and that's not being done. Our modern universities are not measuring up because they're only copies. It's like if you want to run a race, if you're only trying to catch up with others in the race, you will never be able to catch up. The only way you can win a race is to want to be the best. And we can be the best, but not becoming a pale copy of the West. We should do the best of the West as well, but we should present something that the West does not have, which is a curriculum based on our own great 100 texts. And that has not been done. I think that is a challenge that confronts us.
Right. I think that's definitely a challenge and that we need to take it up. Next question. This is how do we contend with appropriation? E.g., example, Christ yoga. I think you just
Well,
mentioned.
you know what? I say we should ignore all of this because true yoga has a whole system associated with it. People can copy outer form. Somebody can wear Gerua Vastra and say, I'm such and such. But ultimately, people will see through it. So we should not worry about these matters. We should do perfection, as Krishna says, yoga karmasu kaushala. We should do everything that we do to perfection. Then these are small distractions, they'll fall away. And we should take the high road. We take the high road. We are there for everybody. It's not either to show people are inferior or whatever. This is for everybody. Come and follow us. We are all a part of this big Ahvan. We are a part of this Vishwa Yajna. And then people will join us. When we embrace them, they'll all join us.
Right. Last question coming up. And this is please suggest some books to learn true Indian history.
Oh, well, there are lots of wonderful books. Rather than list them, you go to a source of free information, go to medium.com and type Subhash Kak. You'll find a lot of free essays. And there are also many of my books which are on the internet. They're also published, but you don't have to pay any money. Just Google them and you'll find them somewhere or the other. And that can be the beginning. And then you'll find many, many other books. There's a lot of great stuff. Many wonderful scholars are doing, and Sanjay ji is one of them. So we need to be a part of that whole samuhu and move on.
All right. Now, there's one last minute question. Did we put our theoretical knowledge to practical use in the past?
Wonderful that this is the question being asked, because I think this is a challenge that we face right now as well. If you ask me, why is it that China has overtaken India even in IT, even though they don't use English language? And perhaps English language is our handicap. We are deluded. This is our sammoha, that we think that English is our advantage. Our real problem is that we are not doing practical stuff. India's real problem is that we are doing too much of theory. Even in universities, even in AI and IT, if you are doing AI, it's not enough just to write papers, because we are doing that for personal fame. We have to write code. If you write code for AI, that becomes a company. If you write code for an algorithm for cybersecurity, that becomes a company. That's what Israel has done. They have become at the highest level in cybersecurity because you have these algorithms which everybody knows. They are mathematics. India has a lot of mathematicians. But we do just that math and then we don't implement it. That's what we need. We need more of implementation. We need less of theory. So I'm totally with you.
Correct. So that brings us to the close of the session. So it's absolutely wonderful. For the first time, we have spent more time in Q&A than the original part of the discussion. So that shows how popular your discussion has been. Thank you very much, Professor Subhash Kak. And the response indicates that people want you here more and more. So thank you.
Sanjay ji. Thank you, Sanjay ji. Really happy to be here.
Good day to you. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Hind.